You're listening to Queering Premodern Asia, a limited series and season 5 of the Nuances podcast. This narrative series is about queerness, love, and premodern life in Asia, featuring discussions with queer Asian co-hosts and scholars. I'm your host and producer Lazu. I'm a cis straight Chinese American woman who spent the last year researching and developing this series. I'm excited to be joined by my guest co-host for today, Stella Gold.
I'm Stella Gold. I'm a mixed Filipinx queer non-binary artist, death doula, and rebirth and wealth coach for changemakers, and come from a lineage of activists. I'm the founder of My Gold Standard, a believer in wealth activism, pro-liberation from all oppressive systems, and collective care.
Content warning: this limited series explores historical contexts of love, gender, sexuality, and cultural norms. Exploration of those themes should not be deemed as an endorsement of those practices. It was a different time with different norms. This information is for entertainment purposes only. Mature themes may be explored. Some things that were normal then definitely aren't now. Today's episode includes mention of suicide, transgenerational relationships, and violence against queer folks. Listener discretion is advised. For references, show notes, and more ways to listen and support, go to nuancespod.com. You can also follow us on social media at nuancespod. Episode 7, Performing Gender. In Episode 3, we talked about many pre-modern Southeast Asian cultures that included gender roles for third gender or other types of gender that are beyond our Western male-female binary. In this episode, I want to explore the pre-modern gender roles in Asia. We'll see how some of the things that were totally congruent with straight masculinity or femininity in Qing China, for example, would be considered totally gay today. What does that say about gender roles and how static they are? Before we're even born, a sex is assigned to us, and with it, a gender role. What's a role? You're given a script, the outline of a character, and you can only deviate so much from it before you're told this isn't an improv class. What are these scripts? How have they changed over time? Soon-to-be parents might daydream about their little girls playing with dolls and growing into a graceful young woman, or little boys playing with cars and growing into responsible providers for their families. This is quite natural to envision the future, and at first it all seems harmless, until it isn't. Queer young people are more than 4 times as likely to attempt suicide than their peers. The Trevor Project estimates that more than 1.8 million queer young people aged 13 to 24 seriously consider suicide each year in the US alone, and at least one of them attempts suicide every 45 seconds. In 2023, a national survey found that 41% of queer young people seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, half of them being transgender and non-binary youth. But even for cis straight kids, these get problematic. If you ask the average Westerner to describe manhood, you'll probably get answers like protector, provider, brave, tough, possibly some type of sports, and you'll quickly realize what they have in mind as a Marvel movie character. But is that all men are? From a very young age, girls are socialized to enjoy playing house, being interested in fashion and beauty, and loving everything pink. They're also taught to seek protection from male figures, and that they're better suited for domestic and supportive roles. As young adults, women tend to have a harder time being taken seriously at work and are less likely to be recognized for their work than men. Boys, on the other hand, are socialized to be brave adventurers and protectors and to associate more with blue. We teach them to feel superior to women when we make fun of them for losing to a girl. We imply that showing emotions is girly and thus inferior when we tell them to man up. Even children's media is complicit.
Progressive children's media, like tomboy girl who is like scolded by her mom, resents her mom, and then she accomplishes something, and then she just walks into the sunset. Yay! But we don't see the other one. We don't see the boy who likes to play with dolls, sewing, and knitting, scolded by his dad, walking into the sunset. We don't get to see that, right? Because of misogyny. What girls like is automatically inferior.
While the patriarchy clearly hurts women and queer folks, men also suffer from it. Men are 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women, and also have more trouble seeking help with their mental health or being taken seriously when they do. In recent decades, some parents have tried to challenge these gendered limitations. I know that many parents have given their kids gender-ambiguous names so that whoever is reading their resume or business card wouldn't be able to easily tell whether it's a man or a woman. Taylor Swift's parents are a famous example. I also know parents who try to give their kids toys for both genders to allow them to explore. But very often, the girls will gravitate towards the pink stuff, no matter how hard the parents try. Is there something in our womanly genes that makes us like the sparkly pink stuff? Of course not. In the 1920s, pink was actually preferred for boys and blue for girls, according to the Smithsonian. Boys also wore dresses up until the age of 6 or 7. So what gives? Judith Butler's theory of performativity conceptualizes gender as the repeated stylization of the body, a set of repeated acts within a rigid regulatory frame that congeal over time to produce the appearance of substance of a natural sort of being. I know, very academic. In plain English, gender is a performance. What makes me a woman? It's a combination of ways in which I present myself that are coherent with what we think of as a woman. My hairstyle, my clothes, the way I walk, the way I talk, how I view my role as a daughter, sister, wife. It's all dictated to some extent by gender norms, and every single day I perform according to those norms. What does it mean to be masculine? When I asked Google, its AI gave me a very modern Western answer. Here's what it says. Masculinity is a social construct that refers to the behaviors, attributes, and roles that are considered appropriate for men in a given society. It is defined by a variety of factors, including social expectations. Boys and men are often encouraged to be tough, aggressive, and to reject anything stereotypically feminine. Another factor is power. Masculinity is often associated with power and is typically associated with men. Appearance. Traditional standards of masculinity include muscularity, facial and body hair, and shorter hair. Note here that this is a very Western aesthetic for men. Another factor that they list is roles. Traditional standards of masculinity include being the breadwinner of the family and exerting dominance in relationship. Toxic much. Masculinity can be associated with a range of health and social problems, including anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and interpersonal violence. This is what Google's telling us. I think there's a whole separate conversation to be had about AI and its biases, but we're going to do that in another episode. So let's say that someone who was assigned female when they were born performs the masculine role that Google listed perfectly. Does that make them a man? You're probably thinking, yes, transgender men are men. You're not wrong, but this notion is relatively new in the West. But do you know where it isn't new? Some of the places the West claimed were backwards a few hundred years ago and still is claiming they're backwards now. Take Indonesia, for example. In South Sulawesi, one of the 5 genders recognized by the Bugis people is kalalai, who is assigned female at birth but takes on a masculine presentation. They have jobs men typically do, have female partners with whom they adopt children. However, their gender role is different from that of a cis man. For example, they'll wear an earring on the right ear while cis men wear it on the left ear in their culture. They're also expected to have a mix of both female and male virtues, such as bravery and devotion. They might act more masculine or feminine depending on the situation, so their gender has some fluidity to it. Conversely, kalabai in the Bugis society is someone who is assigned male at birth but takes on a female presentation. In the Philippines, even local rulers deferred to the local shamans, who were either women or what we would today label as trans women, born male but fully transitioned into a female role in society. They not only dressed as women, but did everything else women did except bear children. They would have jobs that were typically done by women in society. They would even be married to men who may have had other wives with whom they had children. And because women enjoyed high status in pre-colonial Philippines, so did these quote-unquote trans women. In Japan, too, femininity was revered. You might remember from episode 5, the goddess Amaterasu, who is the most famous deity of the Shinto religion. Or Chigo from episode 3, the teenage Buddhist acolytes who dressed in feminine ways, wore makeup, and were idolized by Buddhist monks. Chigo were depicted as feminine in erotic tales that Professor Sachi Hori studied. Some of the ways in which their femininity was depicted was through their hair, their makeup, and clothes. However, they were not treated exactly the same as women, because it was okay for Chigo to be very seductive and very forward in their advances. That would not have been seen as appealing coming from a woman, but coming from Chigo, that was super sexy. Embodying this gender fluidity was part of the appeal. Chigo was not the only example of flirting with gender in Japan. Several performance art forms also involved playing with gender. Shirabyoshi was a song and dance performance done by women cross-dressed in male attire. It became popular in the 12th century. These women were seen as hot, by the way. Kabuki also started as an all-female troupe in the 17th century that performed dances and sketches in Kyoto. They would play both male and female roles. When women were banned from performing in 1629, Kabuki then became an all-male theatrical form, which it still is today. In literature, too, the idea of gender fluidity was often explored. One such tale is Torikae Bae from the 12th century. I sincerely apologize if I'm not getting the pronunciations right. Two siblings, Himegimi and Wakagimi. Himegimi is the female and Wakagimi is the male sibling. They seem to have interests that align more with the opposite sex. So Himegimi, who was born a girl, did not enjoy the girly things. Instead, she was full of mischief and enjoyed masculine hobbies like archery and kickball. Her brother, Wakagimi, was very shy and preferred playing with dolls and seashells or painting rather than studying Chinese classics like young boys are supposed to do. Their parents tried to convince them to behave like girls and boys do, but eventually they gave up and allowed them to switch genders by switching their identities. So Himegimi became Wakagimi and Wakagimi became Himegimi. Their parents even gave them corresponding coming-of-age ceremonies for a man and a woman, and they took on the masculine and feminine roles in Japanese aristocratic life. The tale does imply that this was strange for them to be identifying with a gender role that didn't match their biological sex, and being strange in a way was likely to invite gossip, so it was kept secret. Throughout the story, the siblings worry that they'll be found out. They're able to change gender and live as the gender they want, but it's not an easy transition. Himegimi, whose menstruation is described in the story, is living as a male courtier and even gets married to a woman in an arranged marriage by the parents. She finds her young bride, Shinokimi, charming, but they only develop a platonic relationship. Shinokimi has an affair with a man named Saisho, and Himegimi also has affairs with other women outside the marriage. Saisho is mesmerized by this palace lady, who turns out to be Wakagimi, who refuses his advances. So instead, he decides to make a move on Himegimi, who is Wakagimi's sibling and Shinokimi's husband. So this is a very complicated love square. So Saisho is having an affair with Shinokimi and then ends up deciding to pursue her husband because he has a crush on the husband's sister, who actually turns out to be the male sibling. I know, it sounds complicated. Himegimi is not receptive, but Saisho rapes Himegimi and gets her pregnant. As soon as he realizes that Himegimi is female, Saisho starts to think of her as a woman and insists that she takes on a female identity. This causes her to reassume her female identity, wearing feminine clothes, blackening her teeth, drinking hair-growing potions, and secluding herself at a villa. Not only did her physical appearance change, but her attitude and mannerisms too. She became the damsel in distress, relying on her lover completely and clinging to him. She was charming and graceful and everything he desired. It does say, though, that she gave birth to the child while wearing partially masculine attire, although some later versions of the story omitted that part and the part about the menstruation. Wakagimi, who was now living as a woman, was sent to the court as a companion to the crown princess and soon starts to make a move on the princess, who is quite receptive. However, Wakagimi wanted to find his sister at some point in the story, and to do that, needed to switch back to being a man in order to leave the secluded life of palace women to go search for his sibling. The two siblings successfully transitioned back into their originally assigned gender roles at the end of the tale, and while this story doesn't necessarily mean that it was possible for real people in 12th century Japan to cross-dress and take up a different gender in life, some scholars argue that this shows Japanese culture at the time understood gender as something superficial, or maybe a performance. Gender bending is cool in Japan, even today.
In today's Japan too, like stereotypical attractive look of a young Japanese man is kind of like BTS, androgynous. When my American friends come to visit me in Japan, they think all of them are like gay. Or like they turn on TV, all the actors. Oh my God, so many gay actors. No, right? So in Japan, the way they kind of project their maleness, their male gender, is separate from their sexual orientation. And identity is not something we talk a lot about in Japan, especially personal identity. You could talk about your identity as a member of something bigger, or my identity as a Japanese citizen or somebody who works for this company. But individual identity is not something people in Japan think deeply about. People don't think there is anything strange about gender bending as a form of entertainment performance. And then again, it has little to do with their sexuality.
That was Professor Sachi Schmidt-Hori from Dartmouth College. Femininity as an aesthetic is embraced by both men and women, and the ambiguity is a vibe. Genderless fashion is very popular, and stores sell cosmetics targeting both men and women today in Japan. And just because a Japanese man decides to dress in an androgynous way doesn't mean he's not straight. So much of how we understand gender in the modern era is based on how people look and how they're portrayed. Hairstyles, clothes, the way we walk, talk, the accessories we wear, our shoes. And while it is true that most societies seem to have gendered norms, it wasn't always true that you could tell one from the other so easily. In her book, Women with Mustaches, Men Without Beards, Afsaneh Najmabadi includes several pre-modern Persian paintings of lovers where it is hard to tell the gender of the lovers. Similarly, in Persian poetry, the beloved was often ambiguous and sometimes referred to young men. Cross-dressing has a long history in many forms of theater around the world. Even in Europe, there was a time when women were not allowed to perform and men played both the male and female roles. In Korea, the Namsadang were an all-male traveling troupe who would perform sketches, puppet shows, and music, and also engage in male prostitution. In India, the men playing feminine roles in the Parsi theater were the subject of much adulation. In China as well, in some eras, women were not allowed in theaters, so all the female roles were played by good-looking young men. And the men who attended those plays built an entire culture around admiring these beautiful male actors. You know how the origin story for Facebook was initially to have a site to rank college kids based on how attractive they are? What if I told you that Zuck was late to the party by, 230 years or so? During the Qing Dynasty, around 1790, flower guides emerged. These were rankings of young male actors by literati who attended the theater. These guides would evaluate the actors based on their attractiveness, their performance, and other qualities. Here's an example from circa 1874. Autumn hibiscus was stylish, but also pretty and carefree, thus satisfying men of both high and low taste. He had a natural ability to hold his wine. He was always wholehearted in his affection, treating rich and poor alike, and whether a customer arrived in silk cap or cotton jacket, he would offer the same high level of courtesy. In the mid-18th century, Beijing tea halls began to put on theatrical performances as a way to compete for customers. This catches on and eventually develops into the Beijing Opera. Before the Qing Dynasty, theater was something that only the imperial court or wealthy families could commission, and of course the guest list was limited to the elite. Common folk had their own forms of theater performance, but although the elite could go and watch it, that didn't happen very often. The rise of the opera scene in Beijing creates a cultural shift for theater from being something that is viewed at private parties on special occasions by selected guests who didn't get to choose the program, to being something that can be enjoyed year-round by all men from all walks of life, choosing from a wide range of shows and public theaters. Women did not have access to public theaters until the early 20th century. Theaters became that third place, so to speak, a place for men to hang out that wasn't work and wasn't home. This gives rise to star culture that focuses on the flowers on stage. Men started to socialize around this theater culture, talking about their favorite actors, comparing notes, and many of the young performers would also be male prostitutes, so they would date the actors as well. Soon, Hua Pu, or flower guides, started circulating. Among the literati men, writing those rankings was as much part of theater culture as attending the shows themselves. If you wrote a good one, you'd get the approval and praise of all the other men who are in the know. It's kind of how men compare sports athletes and rattle off their stats today. How many times have I heard men arguing about which of their favorite players was better than the other? If modern men perform masculinity by showing interest and knowledge in sports, men in late imperial Beijing performed it by showing impeccable taste for beautiful men and an appreciation for theater. This was the most elite, manly thing you could possibly do in Beijing in that era. A recent study has shown that taking theater class improves mental health, increases empathy, and helps recently incarcerated folks to better adjust to life outside of prison. Could other men also benefit from theater and taking on a different role than they've known their entire life? What if it wasn't weird for a man to wear nail polish or makeup or a dress? Remember the Chinese poet, painter, lyricist, and playwright Wu Cao from episode 2? The one who wrote a poem where she expressed her desire to possess another lady's jade body completely and carry her away in a red-painted boat? Our co-host for that episode, Karen Zhang, herself a poet, said that there was no doubt in her mind that this was no platonic love. But that's not all. In addition to being one of the best lyricists ever, Wu Cao was also known for a gender-bending play she wrote called Drinking Wine and Reading Encountering Sorrow. Wu Cao is probably my favorite character in this series because she, or they, transgress gender boundaries. To be honest, I'm not quite sure what pronoun to use here, but since the scholars I am referencing use she, I'm going with that. Plus, fun fact, the third person pronoun in Chinese used to be gender neutral. Ta was used for he, she, and it. But in the late imperial era, as Chinese scholars were translating more and more books from the West, they felt the need to introduce a gendered version. So the feminine version is written slightly differently now, but it's still pronounced the same way. It's all ta. Back to Wu Cao's play, Drinking Wine and Reading Encountering Sorrow. Drinking wine and reading poetry was a symbol of becoming a mingshi, famous gentleman. From the get-go, these are things that only men do, not women. Encountering Sorrow is an ancient Chinese poem from the 3rd century BCE. It's a woe is me autobiography about a guy who's been plotted against by his foes in court and unfairly rejected by the ruler. The literati referenced it for centuries, and its popularity increased during politically turbulent times when the poets identified strongly with its frustrated protagonist. When Wu Cao incorporated it in her play around 1825, her male colleagues got it immediately. They could relate to it. They wrote glowing reviews, and of course, being men, all the reviews were very centered around their own experience, how much they felt undervalued in society, how they felt seen in her play. China had a national exam system, and you had to pass it to get an official government job. Government jobs were good. Many of Wu Cao's male colleagues didn't do so well in those exams, and maybe were a little bitter about it. They really identified with Wu Cao's frustration at the system. She couldn't get in because she's a woman. So they identify with her frustration and her feeling of being underappreciated. In Wu Cao's play, the protagonist is a lot like Wu Cao herself. She's a poet and a painter. She's not interested in being a girly girl, but likes to do all the stuff men do, like enjoying poetry, drinking wine. She might even be better at it than they are. It drives her a little nuts that she won't ever get as much recognition for her work as she deserves because she is female. If you recall from episode 2, at the time, a common saying was, "A woman without talent is a virtuous one." When the play starts, she is admiring a painting she just finished. It's a self-portrait of herself cross-dressed as a male scholar. Throughout the play, she laments over the fact that, unlike her male peers, her works will be forgotten when she dies. She will never get the recognition she deserves. Her talent is wasted because she's a woman. She feels that the person in the painting is the only one who can understand her, and at the end of the play, she sort of becomes one with the painting. Interestingly, Wu Cao herself painted such a self-portrait. She then had one of her female friends paint the one used on the stage for that play. Also, at the time, plays were assumed to be autobiographical, so it was clear to everyone that this play was autobiographical. At the time of writing, women were allowed on stage in Chinese theaters. However, Wu Cao indicated in her directorial notes that the lead should be played by an actor who was trained to play the male lead. So this actor is male, but playing a female character who likes to cross-dress as a man. In late imperial China, having a social circle, also known as hanging out with friends, was a masculine status symbol because it implied that you were able to travel and meet other people outside your household. Women's friendships tended to be mostly among family circles or through letters. They had to be content with pen pals. Remember those? Gen Z or younger, there was a time when the internet didn't exist and you could instead get matched to a random stranger around the world and write letters to each other using a pen. What a wild time. Wu Cao, though, did not just stick to pen pals. There is evidence that she had male poet friends and attended events at literary clubs that were men only, such as the poetry society named Chanting Club of the East Pavilion. Her work was included in an anthology of works by the members of that club. She somehow became one of the boys and was accepted as such. The Complete Annals of the Great Viet mentions the story of Le Duan, also known as An Dai Phuong, a member of the royal family who was intelligent, knowledgeable, and strong, but stubborn and fond of wearing women's clothes. He was the crown prince in line to succeed his dad, Le Tien Hong, but he was a bit of a rebellious child, and he tried to poison his mother one time after disobeying her. Because of this, he was demoted, and the third son was made crown prince instead. After that, he became very loyal to his mother. He died young at age 30 and was buried in her commune of Bien Ha, where he became known as a local god of fortune, who is believed to have protected local armies and helped them in battles later on. You might remember from episode 1 that King Kaiden was also criticized for his taste in clothing, as he loved covering himself in jewelry and dressing up like a woman. He even had a male lover who accompanied him on all his trips and rarely slept with any of his 12 wives. Kaiden was deeply unpopular, but not because of his taste in fashion or men, but because he was seen as a puppet of the French administration who had no problem exploiting his own people for his benefit. For example, he allowed the French to raise taxes on peasants, and part of that money went to building his mausoleum. Not cool. It's interesting to me that in both cases, it does not seem like their affinity for girly clothes or accessories was necessarily the major issue, at least not according to the records I could find. In episode 5, we talked about the Korean King Haekung, the 36th king of the Shilla dynasty, who was described as a man by appearance but a woman by nature. In his childhood, he liked to play with girls' toys. He would play pranks like women do, and he carried silk purses and flirted with men. While he did become king at the age of 8, after his father's death, his femininity quickly became a liability, losing him the respect of many of the men supposed to serve him. He was killed at the age of 22 in a coup by his subordinates because they could not accept his femininity. Unlike his Vietnamese counterpart, his affinity for girly things was definitely seen as transgressive, and he was punished for it. Throughout the series, I've provided many examples of gender and sexual diversity that existed in pre-modern Asia in ways that challenge our modern Western models. However, that does not mean that our pre-modern past was a tolerant utopia. It would be more accurate to say that what was perceived as going against the norm was different. what is seen as aesthetically pleasing or acceptable was different. Take, for example, Wu Cao's homoerotic poetry, where she declares she wants to possess another woman's jade body. An equivalent poem by a woman for a woman might be considered risque in some parts of the US even today. But at the time, that wasn't the case at all. In China, homosociality was the norm, meaning women spent a lot of their time among other women in women-only spaces. Same with men. This is still true even in modern times. Here's Professor Tun Wu describing homosocial environments in China during her college years.
When I was still a child, like a man have a big hug with other man or hold them or sleep in one bed, not necessarily have sex. People thought this is totally normal. It's not like Western society, like a man only hug with a woman and shaking hand with a man. In China, actually, just the opposite. Men do not, you can't touch other man's wife. You can have like a big hug with their husband. That is fine. For women too. When I was in the university, the girls are always very close. People thought that's perfectly normal. So that is very different. Some of my friends, when they first go to China, they thought, oh, they are lesbian or gay. These girls or boys are so close. But not necessary.
It was not uncommon for women to write poems about other women, extolling their qualities. In the late imperial era, among women of the gentry class and high-class courtesans, attraction between women was consistent with literary propriety. Meaning what exactly? In that era, gentry class women were becoming increasingly educated, and many of them, like Wu Cao, wrote novels, dramas, poetry. It was actually proper at the time to write about attraction to other women. That's why Wu Cao continued to be respected and praised by her male peers as well. However, if she had been unmarried, things might have been different. Marriage resistance was seen as an act of rebellion, especially in the late imperial era where gender imbalance grew wider and there weren't enough women for all the men to marry. Wu Cao was married to a merchant who had no interest in literature whatsoever. Sources say she was clearly dissatisfied with her marriage, but in those days, marriage was a duty. Love or compatibility wasn't really part of the equation in most cases. In her later years, Wu Cao became a Buddhist nun and lived in a monastery. Some of the scholars studying these women's work caution us against imposing our modern Western lens on everything, with one of them saying they would likely refer to it as love between women instead of homosexuality. Some even say that they adopted a male voice because they were frustrated by the restrictive, sexist society that they were in and wished they could just be with other women who would understand them better than the men ever could. And that could well be true. I myself have rebelled against gender norms my entire life, even though I'm straight. At the same time, I'd also have rebelled against them if I were a lesbian. Even more so, probably. So these women could also just have been attracted to women. In her book, The Emerging Lesbian, Cao Lansang asks, okay, what if there were many viewpoints back then, and one of those was that they understood lesbians exactly the way we do now, except they couldn't openly talk about it? Because again, two women couldn't just live out their love story together without a man involved, practically speaking. Some scholars believe that Wu Cao's cross-dressing and her admiration for women, etc., were all within the limits of performing femininity at the time. They think it was more like role play or a feminist pushing gender boundaries rather than a desire to be another gender or to love a woman. There were also several other plays by both female and male writers that involved cross-dressing. That was a common theme. Certainly the poem Hua Mulan, which we all know as Mulan the Disney movie, is a perfect example of a Chinese classic that plays with gender norms. But just because same-sex desire and cross-dressing was consistent with what women could do, doesn't mean that some of these women didn't want more than that, if you know what I mean. In Chinese history, male-male love was never taboo until modern times. However, in the late imperial era, the passive partner became subject of ridicule. Here's Professor Tsun Wu again.
One type is the penetrated, which people totally accept it. They are normal men. But the other is penetrated men. And they thought this is different. They are men, but acting as women. So they thought they are inferior because a woman is inferior to man. And if a man acting as a woman, people dismiss them. People just thought that this man not have proper masculinity in their life. So that's why penetrated man usually is from lower class. And the penetrated man is upper class. But of course, this is only theoretically say so, because there is one case about Deng Banqiao, who is a very famous Chinese literati, is a very famous artist, also an official. He does not have any interest to women, but only love men. He has quite a lot of lovers, and one day his friend asked him, says, you keep playing with the boys, so if one day one boy just turn over and rape you, what do you do? And he says, I will happily accept it. No big deal.
So the one doing the penetrating is always seen as what we would consider today a straight man, whereas the penetrated man was seen as basically girly, and because Chinese society was very sexist, that was less than. In Japan, we talked about how gender fluidity was aesthetically pleasing. In addition to this, in the case of Chigo and the Buddhist monks, their same-sex transgenerational relationship emulated male-female relationships to some extent, which fit the norm of what was seen as visually pleasing. However, the same wasn't true for Buddhist nuns. There is no term relating to their sex life at all, in contrast to the Buddhist monks. Like in many other societies, in Iran, transgenerational relationships between men were common, and being attracted to young, beardless men did not make adult men any less manly. Similarly, these young, beardless men were not seen as any less manly for being the object of desire for older men. Once they grew beards and transitioned into adulthood, they too might be attracted to younger males. However, if they continue to be the object of desire for older men, or want to continue to be the object of desire for older men once they're past that age, then that would be considered not manly. That's another example of how the line between gender roles has looked different throughout time and space. In the West, feminist movements as well as queer liberation movements have pushed the boundaries and blurred the lines. The Western approach to dismantle misogyny has largely imitated the patriarchy it seeks to destroy. Pants became popular in women's fashion during the women's liberation movement in the 60s and 70s. Even in the 2000s, if you look at feminist figures, you have Hillary Clinton, who had to prove that she was just as much of a war criminal as the men, based on how she voted. Then you have Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In movement that teaches women to demand what the men have because they deserve it just as much. And the way to demand it is to do what the men do. It's almost as if to be taken seriously, we need to be less girly and more like a man. I've definitely heard men comment about women's appearances and how they view super girly women as infantile or not serious. This is a frustration that Professor Sachishmit Hori expressed when we talked because Japan has a very feminine aesthetic. Femininity wasn't always demonized.
When I first came to this country, especially after I pursued academia, there was a lot of condescension towards somebody like me. I didn't want to change it because if I change, then nothing's going to change. I think it's good that some, female professionals can be feminine and then also other things too. Like you don't have to choose one or the other. But there's a school of thought about, if you wear makeup, if you dress feminine, if you take your husband's last name, blah, 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 then you are not ABC. Homophobia, transphobia, or anti-non-binary gender, it's all tied to misogyny. And this misogyny is not so much about women's rights issue, but stigmatizing femininity. So feminism didn't save femininity.
A 2022 study in the Chinese Sociological Review showed that having a more egalitarian gender ideology, meaning if you think that both partners should contribute equally at home and should be able to pursue fulfilling careers and be rewarded equally, this led to higher levels of happiness for both men and women. Similar studies were done in the Netherlands, United States, Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. Another study in the UK showed that those who held traditional gender ideologies were more likely to have suicidal thoughts. And this was affecting men more than women, because these traditional quote-unquote values, if you will, also put pressure on men to perform and maintain their role in this hierarchy. Whether you're cis or trans, gay or straight, you've probably rebelled against gender norms at some point because we contain multitudes and we don't like to be limited. So if gender is all made up and it's a performance that we somehow all agree to put on for the rest of our lives, how can we change the script to make it less harmful for everyone? Because our current scripts are all for this terrible play called the patriarchy, and it sucks for everyone, whether you're a woman, a queer person, or a cis straight white male. In a moment, I will bring back our co-host, but before I do that, I would like to thank you for being a listener. This project has been a labor of love, a ton of work, but also incredibly inspiring. I feel like it finally gave me some non-European anchor points that really expand my understanding of queerness, of gender fluidity, and really of progressive views in general. If you have been enjoying this series, it would mean so much if you were to show your appreciation either by leaving a review or rating on whichever platform you're listening to now. You can also subscribe on Apple. I also have a Substack, which I will link to in the show notes, where you can subscribe for $5 a month or $50 a year. I do all of this work for free. I'm not getting paid to do this. And it does take a lot of time and resources. So if you want to help me continue doing this work, any contribution would be much appreciated. Okay, on to our discussion with Stella. Stella, thank you so much for taking the time to be my co-host today.
I'm so honored to be here and have this conversation.
I sent you the script a couple days ago. What were your thoughts?
My initial thoughts, honestly, was deep grief. I didn't know about all of the Asian cultures that had multiple genders. When I think about gender, even in the non-binary sense, I think there's male, female, and then non-binary is this third gender. And to see that there was a culture, which I believe
The Bugis culture in Indonesia?
Indonesia, yes, that they have 5 genders.
Yeah.
That, and to see all of the different people in history that were gender fluid and expressive and expansive in their gender identity, it hurt because I just didn't know that those people existed, because the way that they are now painted in history is in such a binary. My initial feelings were grief.
Yeah. And that was part of why I wanted to make the series, because our Asian cultures today are seen as lagging behind in terms of queer liberation. And I'm like, but it wasn't always this way, though.
Yeah. And when you really think about history, the gender binary is pretty new, and pre-colonial history, expansive expressions of gender, it was not only the norm and accepted, it was celebrated. At least in my culture and heritage, in the Philippine culture, not only is it within shaman communities, thinking about Babaylan and how they were seen in such high regard and celebrated. And even in Philippine mythology, the gods were also gender fluid and expansive and trans, and they were honored. They were prayed to. Like the idea that prayer was connected to third genders or a multitude of genders, it just really, it blew my mind.
Yeah, I don't know if you've listened to episode 5, but that one was all about God, sex, and the patriarchy, and we went over some of those stories. Yeah, a lot of cultures had hermaphrodite gods, gender fluid gods. Was there any particular story that really resonated with you in the script?
There's a section in the script about the Qing dynasty, and one of the scholars that you mentioned, it was Wu Zhao.
Wu Zhao, yeah.
And when you wrote about Wu Zhao's poetry, it had such queerness in it. For me, seeing that and reading that and knowing that existed and was, again, celebrated and was a part of the norm, it moved me. This is, for me, my own projection, because I have a hard time being connected to my masculine. I guess I'm saying masculine in quotes because even feminine and masculine feels binary, although I know that it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. I shy away from my masculine side because I feel like people can really notice and tell that my gender is very expansive. And I also don't know how to perform masculinity, which you did write about in the script. I'm like, how do I perform that as a non-binary person? And so I'm definitely in a deep exploration myself, and to read about Wu Zhao and how she was in this exploration too.
Yeah.
I feel like she's an ancestor, a queer ancestor that I'm definitely going to be calling in when I'm in need of that inspiration.
Yeah. I think that's a good point to talk a little bit more about your own story. What was it like for you growing up as a kid? When did you understand you were queer? What was that like navigating that?
I grew up in the Bay Area with my Filipino family. Like culturally, that's where I grew up mostly in terms of culture.
Hmm.
All of my Filipino family immigrated together
Oh,
in the
wow.
80s. Yeah, so they posted up in the Bay, and
Nice.
I think like growing up, I feel like my queerness was definitely questioned when it was related more so to gender. For myself, I grew up with a bunch of boy cousins. I was hanging out with a lot of them, doing what was deemed boy things, playing in the dirt, climbing trees, playing video games, wrestling. I didn't have a stage of performing femininity, which was like playing with Barbie, until it was told to me by my mom, by family members. I know like you're playing with your cousins and stuff, but eventually, do you want to play with Barbie dolls? Do you want to play with your girlfriends? Do you want to make new friends or hang out with your girl cousins? And I just did not. I felt so weird. And I think that was my first experience of dysphoria, where I was like, why do you want me to play with my girl cousins? And why don't my girl cousins come play with me and my boy cousins? It was them trying to remove me to fit in more of these binary gender
Mm,
norms.
interesting. So,
Yeah.
is that common in Filipino culture for the boys and the girls to play separately?
I don't know if it's a Filipino culture thing. I think it was an assimilation thing. I
Mm,
think that because I didn't grow up in the Philippines, I don't have that context, unfortunately, which is a deep grief. But being like Filipino American, and having all of our family members assimilate, I think that it was very common for them to, and this is me assuming, I don't really, now I'm like, oh, maybe I should ask my mom
yeah.
but it was definitely a point in time where this separation, the gender binary, became something that they were thinking about and projecting onto me and
Yeah.
my cousins.
And when did you finally have the vocabulary to really understand what was happening?
So I'll separate two moments in my life. I did assimilate into this feminine role. Ended up being like, okay, I can like Disney princesses and I can wear jewelry. And I almost was like borrowing my mom's clothes because I just didn't know how to perform being feminine. Once I hit 12 years old is when I started to notice that I definitely felt like I wasn't just a girl, but I didn't know that there was any other way. The word tomboy came into my vocabulary, and everyone would refer to me as, oh, like they're just a tomboy. They just grew up that way, and all of these things. And then because I had this tomboy element, they were like, so do you like girls then? Are you a lesbian? Because of course they're thinking I must be a lesbian. I can't be someone that is really cis or straight if I'm a tomboy. And so then that was the second thing. I started asking myself, I don't think I'm a lesbian because I clearly have boy crushes. I've always had boy crushes, but I guess I've had girl crushes too. And once it was 8th grade, so when I turned 13, I did have my first conscious girl crush. And that's when my friend asked me, I was like, yeah, I think I have a girl crush, but I don't know. Maybe I am a lesbian. I don't know. And she was like, I think you might be bisexual. And the concept of bisexuality, I was like, what? You can
I have
do
options.
that? You can have that? And I remember this was MySpace era. So I updated my MySpace before I went to high school to include bisexual because my friends were just so whatever about, they're like, yeah, I think you might be bisexual. It wasn't even a thing for them. But once I went to high school, I went to a Catholic college prep high school. Yeah, it was rough. I went there for 1 year, and that says everything that you need to know. I was like, I'm miserable and this place sucks. And my MySpace having bisexual as an option, I experienced the most othering. I wouldn't say I was bullied in the way that you hear other people were, but I was definitely isolated and ostracized and was looked at weird, was avoided. Like people didn't want to change in front of me in the girls' locker room because they thought I would be sneaking a peek. And that's a little bit narcissistic of you to think that I would be. But I also was having really intense boy crushes still. It was still in this confusion of that I still had to pick a side, even though there was the term bisexual. You know, it
Yeah.
still felt like I was afraid to be bisexual.
Yeah.
After my freshman year of high school, I transferred to a public school. I got my first real boyfriend, and I thought I dodged this bullet. I guess I'm straight because I now have no desire for, I'm just all about him and this relationship. And I found myself in relationships with men moving forward from that moment. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s, that's where I would call my quakening, my queer awakening, where like you actually can't go back. Like it is so powerful that there's no more suppressing. Like everything that I've suppressed just bubbled up and exploded. And I had a crush on a friend of mine that I met while I was doing the nanny thing in New York City. I lived in New York City. In 2015, my father unexpectedly passed. After his death, I reevaluated lots of things in my life. I don't know if it's because I was already in the mindset of thinking about, wow, like, how do I live my life now from this? What do I do? Who am I? I want to live life to the fullest as being me, and I don't know who that is. There was another nanny that worked with the same kid that I did. And I remember seeing her, and I don't know what it was about her, but that was just an undeniable crush that I had. I couldn't deny it any longer. And I was already in a long-term relationship with the current partner that I have now. And I remember coming home and telling him, I have a crush. I don't know what this means, but I cannot stop thinking about her. I think about her all the time. I feel like I'm in puberty again. I'm crying about it. Like I'm just so overwhelmed by this crush. He was very kind and accepting and was like, you talked about being some level of queer before, but you never really went past, oh, it was a thing that I thought I was. And it's okay that you want to explore that part of you and figure out who you are and who you want to be when it comes to your queer identity. And so that was when, because I was starting to be more active in my queerness, whether it be being in queer community, embracing queer culture, and dating other queer people, I realized that this is now a very big part of my identity that I don't want to hide behind anymore. And so after a year or maybe 2 years of really diving deep in my queerness, I finally came out to my mom and just told her straight up I was in a relationship with At the time, this person identified as a woman, but they are now non-binary as well. And so I told my mom, like, yeah, I was in a queer relationship with this person. I love them. And we broke up, and I'm really sad about it. But it made me realize that I'm queer. And my mom's reaction was very weird. It wasn't not accepting. But it was like she still didn't understand. She's, oh, well, but you're still with Sean, right? And I'm like, yeah. And she's, oh, so you're like Miley Cyrus. She was with Liam, and then they broke up, and then she was with the woman, but then they broke up, and then she went back to Liam. And I was like, no, it's not quite that. But you know what? I'm not going to unpack that with you. Like, Miley Cyrus is still queer.
I didn't even know that about her.
I didn't know that about her either until she told me that.
It's interesting that she had a reference like, oh, it's just like the celebrity that I heard about. Oh, I guess that's fine.
It's interesting because my mom, even in that moment, I just accepted that it's okay if she doesn't fully understand. It is something that I had to unlearn for myself. Like, how long did I not understand myself?
Yeah.
It was because of the dominant culture that puts the gender binary front and center and erases queer identities. And I had to extend that grace to my mom, at least at first. And then when I came out as non-binary, it was because I was moving back in with my mom. And I was thinking to myself, I'm not going to feel okay if I'm hiding this very big part of myself. And I don't know if she'll get it right. And I don't know if she'll use the pronouns. My pronouns are they, them. I don't know if she'll use it right, but I need to vocalize this for myself.
Yeah.
And when I told her I was non-binary, she was like, I think I know what that is. Mariel's friend is non-binary. Mariel's my sibling. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. And she's like, yeah, I know. She kind of wanted to make it seem like, hey, I know it's okay. I understand. But then once it came to living with her, I was like, oh, you like don't understand. And, I gave her a book. And then I also started noticing that she already accidentally misgenders me, but also genders me in ways that feel affirming. And I learned that, so she will call me he sometimes, and she'll call me it very much like interchangeably. It's because in the Filipino language, it was primarily gender neutral until the Spanish influence came in. I got really excited when she'd slip in a he, and I'd be like, oh, I definitely do feel affirmed with this he pronoun. I feel great.
You said she thought she knew what that was, but she didn't really. Do you feel like she does now?
I came out to her almost 2 years ago. I think that she knows that I am non-binary and that I don't identify as a woman, but she doesn't understand the pronouns. I think she's just still learning and training her brain to use the right pronouns. But she also still sees me as her daughter. And this is a choice that I made. I feel okay with her seeing me as her daughter because for a very long time I was, and I did identify with that. It's just my version is more gender fluid, whereas she sees me as her little girl that used to wear the crowns and jewelry to be a princess. I think she even misunderstands herself in that way, because when I hear stories and see old photos of her, she also had my experience. She grew up with all her brothers. There was, I think, 8 of them, and it was her and one other sister. And they grew up with all their brothers, and she was like, yeah, I used to play this game of knuckles when you punch each other in the hand and whoever winces first loses. And she would do that. And all the boys, she said, would be so scared of her because she was the strongest and wouldn't even wince. She was very tough. She just shared like, yeah, I always played with the boys. I always wanted to play with my neighbors who were boys. I wanted to play sports. I wanted to play with the ball. I wanted to play games. But my mom was always telling me, if you keep getting dirty and playing in the dirt and, you're never going to get married, you're going to be alone forever, like all of this stuff. And so hearing her share that, I was like, oh, so like you also were thinking how I was thinking about my gender. Why do I have to play a certain role?
I think it's a pretty common experience, right?
Absolutely.
I don't think our parents really tried to separate the girls though, so like we were all playing together. I do remember wanting to do all the things that boys do, but partly I think it was defiance because I knew that the culture, the Chinese culture I grew up in, that there are these strict gender roles and the boys are always assumed to be able to do the more difficult things or the more challenging things, and then the girls are supposed to just sit home and look pretty and learn to cook and do all the girly things. And I was like, no, I want to do all everything the boys do, because why can't I, just because I'm a girl? I don't think so.
I really feel like the gender binary also harms cis people that identify
Yeah.
as male or female, because why does any gender have to have any role?
Yeah, and that's why in the script I mentioned that no matter how you identify, you've probably felt very constrained by gender roles at some point in your life, right? Think about all the men who are terrified of showing emotion, you know?
Oh
Like
my
it's so
goodness.
toxic. And then
Yeah.
it comes out in horrible ways.
Something that surprised me too was it ChatGPT that you used? It regurgitated
But
this
that was
very
Google. Yeah.
oh
Google's
my
AI.
gosh.
Yeah.
I remember reading that in your script and being like, so even AI is like performing gender.
And that's partly why I wanted to include that in there, because there's been so much buzz about AI. I think what people don't understand is that these AI are built on bodies of text that exist. And the bodies of text that exist are sexist and racist. Most of the stuff out there is maintaining systems of oppression that have been here for a long time. It's not neutral. As much as people want to say, oh, AI is going to be, more objective, it's like, it's going to be more predictable. It doesn't mean it's objective. These are two different things. A lot of things are subjective in life based on the culture and the time that you're living in. What does it mean when you say objective? Because if it's trained on data that is from text from 1881, I don't think that's objective today. you know?
It is not objective at all. Everything that you said, I was like, yes, 1,000%. I still am skeptical of it and it scares me for the purposes that you shared and said. And I'm like, we kind of have this opportunity because it is still so fresh and new that we could train tech to be more inclusive, to truly be objective. But I don't know, it feels a little bit like it's not possible because I'm like, tech started out as not inclusive at all. It was male dominated. It had to look and be a certain way. Like even in the industry itself.
Yeah, I mean, I started my career in tech. I have a general idea of how training models works, and I know
Mm.
that the data that you're training on is going to make or break the thing. In theory, we could train better models and make them more inclusive, but in practice, there's so much junk out there that it's just going to spit out conspiracy theories. So, you know
There's
what I mean? Like,
so much junk.
yeah, because like all the places where you go to hear diverse perspectives, whether it's Substack or Medium or any of those platforms, for every good article, there's also 10 junk ones. so, and also, I feel very conflicted about tech companies exploiting the work of writers and artists
Mm,
to generate profitable products that never pay back the artist. Like the hours that, let's say, I put in to write this script, they can just scrape that and then use it and make money out of it. And I won't get anything. I'm not getting anything to do this podcast. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I feel very conflicted about that.
It's rinse and repeat the same oppressive systems over and over again.
Yeah.
When I was reading your opening introduction and talking about masculinity, something that came to mind was the harm of performing masculinity, whatever that means. When I think about men and gender roles, I think about violence. I think about how, like, coming full circle, you mentioned, yeah, they just lock up their emotions and don't ever express it because being emotive, I guess.
It's girly, and girly is not good.
Yeah. And there's all these words that are just so harmful. Being called like a fruitcake or a pussy or, I don't know, like a sissy boy. And when men and boys, the reason they feel this immense depression and have such high rates of suicide or violence, so violence against others, right? Like the mass shootings that happen in this country are mostly done by cis white men. I really do feel like a lot of it is related to how harmful the gender binary is. I can't even imagine a world. I mean, I can, how beautiful it could be to have men express truly who they are without the mask of what a man is supposed to be.
Yeah.
Right. And so that also came up when I was reading about masculinity and what Google said and all of that stuff.
Yeah. And to me, writing this episode specifically, I really enjoyed reading about how those gender roles, even though they existed throughout time, but just how much they varied. In late Qing China, for example, all the spaces were homosocial. So men hung out with men and women hung out with women. And so it was fine for men to be very physically close and touchy feely with each other, just like women are today. You still see groups of women being very close to each other, like going to the bathroom together. But if a group of men went to the bathroom together, that would be weird, right?
Yeah.
But why?
Honestly. I will say, even though I identify as non-binary, like that part was my favorite pastime. It's let's go to the bathroom and share our deepest, darkest secrets to one another, right?
Yeah, because in that era in Beijing, these men were going to the theater, and their pastime, the manly thing to do, is admire the beauty of young men and write about it. Men today talk about their favorite baseball player, like instead of saying, oh,
Yeah.
listing all the stats of some baseball player, they're like, oh, this boy he can take a lot of wine and he's very good with blah, blah, blah. He performed this play really well. And they're commenting about theater. It's like, why can't men do more of that? I think seeing that what is considered manly had different presentations in the past opens up possibilities, right?
I wonder if back in those times, if there was like a binary of that, right? Their version of what being binary was.
Yeah, there were definitely gender roles. Wu Tao could write poetry about other women. That was fine. That was considered in line with performing a feminine role. What was not in line with performing a feminine role is not getting married.
Yeah.
Different eras had different lines that you couldn't cross. And so even though they could write queer poetry and they could admire the beauty of male actors, they even wrote a whole guide about which actor was the prettiest. It still had these lines that they couldn't cross.
Even as a non binary person myself, the concept of marriage, me and my partner have been together for 11 years now. I can't even imagine how to get married where someone won't be trying to put us in the box doing it in this gendered way. Or the type of wedding or ceremony, really, what I would like to have would be so much in defiance of gender. It would be this fluidity. There would be so much fluidity to it that I feel like our family's brains would just completely short circuit and break.
If you could have the non binary wedding dream, what would that look like?
I think it would be this invitation where everyone that is there could be invited to play and expand with however they want to present. And I don't have, a idea of fashion or what people would wear or whatever, but it would just be like whatever makes you feel like the most you, wear that. Like you can wear whatever you want. I'm sure as hell going to wear whatever I want. And my partner is going to wear whatever he wants. And there will be drag queens. There will be drag kings. There is this Japanese pop star. Oh, I'm just blanking on her name, but she has this music video. The song is called This Hell. When I saw that music video, I was like, this is what I want my wedding to be like. It is fun. It is gay. It is queer. It is expansive. And everyone is just so like they're in their own skin. I feel like it's more of a feeling that I want to invite and emote and have as an experience. Can we all experience this together Let's experience what being fluid truly means and having that be represented. I'm even having a hard time conceptualizing it because I have my own deconditioning to do of what is the norm, but it definitely doesn't have any form of traditional practices that I could think of. I'm definitely not walking down the aisle. I also have this fun idea where me and my partner walk towards each other at the same time instead of like being given away.
Yeah. So, how has it been with the rest of your family and your community, especially the Filipino side? Do you feel like they've more or less accepted it?
I don't hide my identity from my family per se, but I didn't open to them. I didn't come out to them. The way that I entered into embodying my identities was use my pronouns, don't put me in a box, don't hide me because you're afraid. Just address me the way you normally address me in all the queer spaces that I feel safe in. I want to be myself in any space. If they have questions, they can ask. They can be like, oh, I noticed that you use they. And that could be an opportunity to have that conversation. So I came out to my mom. I came out to even my partner's family. And coming out is not just this one time thing. You come out all the time. You remind people all the time. And it just became so exhausting. It felt exhausting that I had to keep reminding people, and I was
Yeah.
tired. And so I just decided that I witness myself. The people that I'm around all the time, I want them to see me. I want to let them in and address me the way that I want to be addressed. And so that's my more immediate family and friends friends, all wonderful and super accepting, but very close family members, specifically my partner's family, I feel like they're still having a hard time. And I think in some ways, it's not just a hard time learning something new. I think they're having a hard time realizing the frustration that they have with their own binary in themselves. Like they definitely have said peculiar things around me that I was like, where did that come from? Like, for example, my partner's mom, who's very sweet, and she gave me this gift. She's like, here's some bike shorts. And my partner was like, Mom, why didn't you get me any bike shorts? And she's like, oh, you want to wear lady shorts? And he's like, why does clothes have to be gendered? And she responded, well, I like my clothes gendered. I like wearing girl clothes. And we're like, okay, auntie, we did it. We did it. I think because it scares her. It scares her to be like, oh, I had other options all this time and I didn't know. I don't know. It's scary when your whole life you've been raised to believe one thing, you've been indoctrinated into it. And then here comes this person who is daring to live outside of the indoctrination.
I think it's possible also that it's not necessarily related to gender itself, but more that
Mhm.
the idea that gender isn't what they thought it was is
Yeah.
destabilizing,
Yes,
right?
destabilizing is such a good word.
So we grew up with boy stuff and girl stuff. And then now you're saying, why do they have to be categories? Why can't boys use the girl stuff? And they're like, wait, what? This is not how the world is supposed to work. And then they're like, what does that mean? Do we all wear things that look like half boy, half girl? What does that mean? You know, like there's just so many things that they take for granted that once you remove that assumption, there's a lot of questions that come up and it can be overwhelming. So I feel like it's more a destabilizing thing.
Yeah, and to further destabilize and add to that, I'd be like, well, you know that gender binary is how they sell things from a capitalistic perspective. Why do girl clothes cost way more than boy clothes? Or why are certain things designed to be inconvenient but very convenient for men? There's
Yeah.
certain things that were integrated into how things are sold to us from a consumerist level as well.
Not only are the girl clothes expensive, but they're also made with poorer materials, in my opinion.
Yeah, very poor materials.
So before we wrap it up, I want to know, what do you hope people will take away from this episode?
What I hope is that people leave being a softer yet braver version of themselves. So if you are a non-binary person, or even if you're cis, being like, I can be brave enough to think about myself and my identity outside of these categories, these boxes of gender. And I'm going to dare to be brave to expand in that. I'm going to see what I can do to explore who I am outside of these gender binaries and what that feels like for myself. As a society, we don't encourage exploration and curiosity. We definitely stay in the very curated lanes. And so if you're listening, I just hope that you find a way to expand a bit more. Even if you think it's something small, I bet you it is something really big. You just don't see it yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a cis woman who has constantly pushed boundaries of what I was allowed to do, I say go for it. Nobody can stop you. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I really appreciate you doing that.
Thank you for all the work that you do and contributions you make to the queer community.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for listening to the end. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Special thanks to Stella Gold for co-hosting with me today. You'll find their bio and links in the show notes at nuancespod.com. Also, thanks to our scholars, Professor Tsun Wu at the University of Hong Kong and Professor Satish Hori at Dartmouth College. We have 2 more episodes in this series. I hope you'll join me next time for episode 8, titled For the Record.